And welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. So glad you joined us today. We're having another in our segment where we allow the Oklahoma voters to meet their candidates for Attorney General.
Yes, indeed. Last week, our viewers met Ryan Leonard. This week, you're going to meet Scott Pruitt, Republican candidate for Attorney General. And next week, you'll meet Jim Priest, a Democratic candidate for Attorney General. And we hope after these 3 weeks, you'll have a good idea of whom it is you want to vote for.
Scott Pruitt, candidate for Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma. It's all coming up today on The Verdict, so stay with us.
The idea of sending American money out of our own economy these days for foreign oil is madness. Yet we're spending $25 billion a month on foreign oil. America's 100-year supply of natural gas can break this pattern and strengthen our economy. See how it can create jobs, generate clean electricity, fuel our cars, and protect our environment at chk.com. Chesapeake, America's champion of natural gas.
Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate. We're accountants. We do taxes, business valuations, estate planning, and consulting. And we're right here in Oklahoma, working with the owners of small and medium-sized businesses. Steve Wilsey and Stuart Meyer have the resources and the experience. Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate in Oklahoma City and Tulsa.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
We are really pleased to have back for another visit on The Verdict, Scott Pruitt. Scott is a Republican candidate for Attorney General. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Kentucky, did his law work at the University of Tulsa while working his way through law school. He was engaged in private practice and was a state senator, elected in 1998, served out a number of terms from Broken Arrow District. Since 2002, he's been co-owner and managing partner for the Oklahoma Redhawks, playing right here in Oklahoma City. And he is running for the office of Attorney General. And we're sure pleased you join us today.
Well, Ken,
welcome back.
Good to see you, Mayor. Good to see you. Thanks for the invitation.
I guess you've been crisscrossing the state, meeting people?
Yeah, I tell people often that my true occupation is I'm a truck driver. So all those things that Ken said are true, but I'm more of a nomad. I'm a nomad at this point, up and down the turnpikes.
What are you hearing? What are voters asking? What are they telling you?
You know, this race for Attorney General, it really has taken on very, very much prominence when you look at the national issues. When you look at the attorneys general across the country, the 20 or so that have joined together to sue the federal government on the health care package, people are paying attention to this race like never before. I think historically people have looked at the Attorney General's office as strictly the chief law enforcement officer handling death penalty cases, and those are very important aspects of the office. But with these national issues, Mayor, I think people are really paying attention because liberty and freedom are at stake, and they want to know that their Attorney General is going to fight for those things.
Well, if that's the hot button issue, what are you going to do if you're elected?
Well, the Attorney General, I think, is very central to that battle because the Constitution can be used to push back on the health care package as an example, with the individual mandate and the Commerce Clause as the defense. I intend on setting up an office internal to the Attorney General's office, a unit devoted to federalism, where I will allocate existing resources, attorneys in the office to wake up each day, go to bed each night, Mayor, focused upon fighting on behalf of Oklahoma's interest as well as the individual liberty of our citizens across the state. And it's not just health care. The EPA is looking at regulating carbon emissions, CO2, without congressional authority. They've indicated they're going to do that under the Clean Air Act. Texas has already indicated they're going to challenge that. Oklahoma should, and I will as an Attorney General. The recent financial reform package that was passed, they're regulating community banks like never before from Washington, all the way down to the ATM charges that you and I are going to pay. So the Attorney General has taken on significance as it relates to federalism, fighting back against Washington, and advancing our state's interest, and I intend to do that.
Is this the 10th Amendment?
It's the 10th Amendment, but it's even more than that. I think you're talking about the federal government intruding upon areas that traditionally have been left to the states. The police power, the consumer protection issues have always been, the statutes and regulations at the state level have governed that from state to state. Community banking is an example. The feds, that balance that's always existed between the feds and the states, as far as roles of government, the federal government in Washington is on an assault to really advance their interests, to really govern very key areas of our life, from environmental to healthcare to financial related issues. We need to stand up on those things and very aggressively.
What kind of feedback, when you're getting around the state talking about these issues of federalism, what kind of feedback from the voters are you getting?
I'm encouraged. People are awakened. I've been at several stops across the state where the question is asked, where there are 600, 700, 800 people in attendance. The question is asked, how many of you are here for the first time? And over 3/4 of the folks in attendance will say, me. That's encouraging. People are very, very in tune to what's going on nationally. They want to do something about it. They want to take ownership back over the system, send a message to Washington, and they want to make sure that the Attorney General is going to be on their side, fighting on their behalf.
Are you sensing any particular movement to just throw the folks out? I won't use any other word. Throw the folks out that are there and get some new folks in.
I think there is a trust issue. I think that voters and citizens across the state of Oklahoma are saying who you're really for when you're serving in office. Are you there to keep your position, your pay, your title? Or are you there to do what's right courageously and maybe at your own expense? And I think it's a very good question the voters are asking. I've been out of politics for 4 years. Didn't have to get back in. I'm burdened by what I see and felt like that I had unique characteristics, share the voters' concerns, and wanted to do something about it. And I think the voters really want to know, are you going up there really to fight for what's right under the Constitution, or are you there for yourself? And that's a good question they're asking, and looking forward to walking with them to make sure we fight under those constitutional values, our concerns.
As Attorney General, Drew Edmondson got involved in a lot of ecological issues involving water and the situation in far northeast Oklahoma. How do you view those issues and the environment in general?
Water is a very important issue for the state of Oklahoma. We're going through a process now studying that as far as what surplus water do we have, if any. The tribal interest, the state's interest, individual interest as far as that resource are being studied as we speak. I think the Attorney General will need to be involved from a compacting standpoint with the tribes, working with other states. Arkansas has threatened to sue Oklahoma if there's water sold to Texas because they use that water for irrigation purposes. You know, so there's lots of state issues that are involved in the water resource, Mayor, that I think we need to be very, very cognizant of. But as far as the poultry issue in northeast Oklahoma, I think what that case really speaks of is how an Attorney General at times, and this Attorney General, I think, used the courts in an aggressive way to regulate through litigation. I think that's wrong. An Attorney General should not be involved in regulating industry through litigation. That's the job of the legislative branch. That's the job of the administrative agencies that walk with the legislative branch. And I, as an Attorney General, will simply enforce the laws as they are passed, but not seek to regulate industries. You know, there are many across the country that are thinking that the fast food industry is next. You know, as far as AGs walking with plaintiffs' counsel to regulate the fast food industry as it relates to obesity. Now, maybe that should be done as far as working with that industry to make sure that they're offering good options as far as healthy options, but it needs to be done through the legislative process, Mayor, and not the litigation process.
Well, I believe the health care bill actually steps into that arena.
That's absolutely true.
And actually, as I understand it, creates the potential for an unfair advantage between chains and locally owned restaurants. So
Yes.
that battle is likely to be battled at somewhere.
But I think the key with the poultry question specifically is, did the Attorney General act to regulate industry through litigation? I think he did in that particular instance. Moreover, the selection of attorneys in that case, one firm stood to gain about $300 million if that case would have been successful. They had a 50% contingency case that they were involved in with that poultry lawsuit. There were $600 million or so alleged damages. That selection of that firm was not open to an open, competitive, transparent bid. I think that's wrong. As Attorney General, when I will select outside counsel to walk with the state on key issues, I will submit that attorney and that process through open, competitive, and transparent bids to make sure that the state's interests are protected and the people know who we're hiring as a state and how they will represent us.
Scott, we did a show last week with Ryan Leonard, and I told Ryan, I asked Ryan this question. I told him that we'd ask all the other two candidates this same question. How would you're on the running on the Republican ticket. How should the voters distinguish between you and Ryan Leonard? Why should they vote for you?
I think there are three key things with respect to by the way, I think every candidate, every race, and a primary in particular, there are strengths that I have, there are strengths that Ryan has. And I think my job as a candidate is to share my strengths, why I think it's relevant for this time, trust the voters with the outcome. I think there are three key things that I would throw out to you. One is the business background that I have. The Attorney General's office has about 150 employees right now, a $30 million or so budget. Having been involved in business, owning a business, running a business, setting priorities, and managing people, that's a very important component of that office, particularly with the multiplicity of issues that you deal with as an Attorney General. It's not just the death penalty. It's not just prosecuting bad guys. It's also dealing with these federalism issues that I've talked about. But secondly, my constitutional law background. Practiced as an attorney for 17 years. My area of practice and specialty has been constitutional law. In fact, my very first case as an attorney, young attorney, was representing a lady who worked for the DHS, who was holding a Bible study in her home, was told that there was a policy in existence that said she couldn't have after evening hours with potential DHS clients, and told her to shut her Bible study down. I took up her interest, took on the state of Oklahoma, protected her First Amendment rights, got her job restored and her ability to hold a Bible study in her home. So I understand what it means to take on government from a constitutional perspective and represent individual liberty. And then thirdly, I think the legislative background that I have, 8 years in the Senate, serving in leadership in the Senate, I understand the interplay between the legislative branch and the AG. I passed laws at the Capitol that were challenged by national groups. I walked with the AG in defending those at that time. That's a very important role. So I think the experience from a legislative standpoint, a business standpoint, a constitutional law standpoint, all those things separate hopefully me in this race, and they're very important concerns in light of the federalism issues we're confronted with.
Scott Pruitt is running for Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma. One more segment with Scott when we get back on The Verdict.
This cane is called For All the Grandfathers, and I dedicate it to my grandfather, Franklin Allen. Me and him just had like a spiritual thing where I just learned lessons from him without him telling me anything. The 3 dots on the feather represent my immediate family, and as my grandfather told me about the Chickasaws, that family is the most important thing. To me, the eagle sees everything, as our elders do, also representing my grandfather and his bravery in the Korean War. I actually just started on the wings for the eagles, and that's when my mother called and told me that he passed away. He took his journey. It's like somebody watching you when nobody's there. I guess he wanted me to finish it, so I finished it. He's been with me ever since. It shows how strong a Chickasaw family can be.
In Oklahoma, with the technology that's being developed every day, it would be difficult to get much better than it is now, but I anticipate that it will.
Technology's always going to improve. It's always going to get better, and as it does, these fields will give up more and more of their natural resources.
I think with technology and the way they're doing it, it'll be a good, clean, environmental place, and I'm blessed to be here.
The oil and gas industry runs deep in our history and gives us a sense that we have a really strong future ahead of us.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers and today's guest, Scott Pruitt. He's running for Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma.
Scott, looked at your website before the show and saw what you list as first principles as liberty, the rule of law, and limited government. Let's talk about liberty first. You've talked a little bit about it in the first segment, but can you expand on that?
Well, anytime that the federal government feels that they are empowered to come in and say to you and I that we must buy a health care product or health care insurance under the Commerce Clause, that is an extraordinary power. That's no different than the federal government coming to you and I and saying that we must buy a GM car. They own GM at the federal level. It affects interstate commerce. It affects their deficits and debt in Washington, D.C. What would be the difference of them saying you must buy a GM car, and moreover, it must be a Chevy with these options? That's what's going on with the health care package, and it sounds outlandish. But the liberty that I'm speaking of is that the federal government, at this point, the leadership in Washington believes that they know better than you and I. And this idea of self-governance, this idea of liberty and freedom, of you and I living our lives in Oklahoma, growing in businesses, growing families, seeing education for our kids in a meaningful way, living life. We're being impacted every day by Washington, D.C., and we need an Attorney General that will protect those interests, liberty interest, against the ever-intrusive federal government.
Next topic, rule of law. What are you thinking there?
Well, rule of law, when you look at elected officials today, I think we have many. In fact, I encountered this a little bit, Mayor, when I was on the floor of the Senate for those 8 years. You'll have many legislators that will enact laws and say, you know what, it's not my job to determine whether this is constitutional or not. And they will advance a piece of legislation and not give thought to the constitutional merits of a particular piece of legislation. I think we have many people in office today that wink at the Constitution, that do violence to the Constitution. And it's my job as an Attorney General to hold them accountable, to say that they took an oath, that they must comply with rule of law, that no one in America, President, Speaker, Majority Leader of the Senate, or anyone in the state level is bigger than the Constitution or bigger than the law. We are ruled by law and not by men, and there's a big difference between the two.
And the third of the first principles was limited government.
Yes, well, there's specific roles that are enumerated in the Constitution that are very clear, and there seems to be some confusion about that at the federal level. The things they ought to be doing, securing the border under the naturalization clause, the guarantee clause of the Constitution, they're not doing, and the things that they're not enumerated to do, health care and EPA and these other things we've talked about, Kent, they're doing. So there needs to be, I guess, a civics lesson that the Attorney General in Oklahoma needs to reacquaint the guys in Washington about, that there are specific enumerated powers that they possess, and they should do those things explicitly and not focus on the things that they feel like they have implicitly.
What would you do to protect religious freedom?
You know, one of the first pieces of legislation I enacted in the state Senate was something called the Religious Freedom Act, and it was we were one of only 10 states at the time. This was around 2000, that elevated protection against government's intrusion upon our First Amendment rights. And I think the biggest thing that you can do as an Attorney General is awaken and make people aware of what can be done as it relates to the First Amendment. What does that mean as far as the application in our daily lives? We in America have the ability to exercise our faith in the public square, and it's not a private faith. And I think the Attorney General should be involved in making sure that people understand and government agencies understand through advice and counsel in advance that they need to be very cognizant of the rights that individuals have to practice their faith in the public square and to make sure we comply with the First Amendment.
Your AG office that you would take over if you were elected would have 65 to 75 lawyers, depending on how the budget turns out and all, and maybe as many as 200 total employees, something like that. You've been managing a large business or a medium-sized business right here in Oklahoma City for a number of years through the Red Hawks. How would your business experience with the Red Hawks management help you in managing that law office?
Well, anytime that you're in business, one of the key things is obviously rallying those that are walking with you toward a vision, toward a purpose, and then measuring that as you go. And leading them individually and leading them corporately and making decisions. As a business, we don't have infinite money. We've got to invest in the right things. We've got to invest in the things that have a return. We've got to equip those that work with us to make sure that they're equipped to do the job that they've been hired to do. As an Attorney General, I think that's going to be very important, managing the attorneys of the office, to give them priority, to give them focus, to lead them toward objectives on behalf of the state of Oklahoma, the traditional role of being very efficient on death penalty cases, prosecuting and ensuring that the multi-county grand jury and the corruption process that we deal with corrupt individuals across the state is done, that traditional role, but also looking at ways that we can challenge the federal government from a federalism standpoint and equipping our folks to do that and do that successfully. So I think the leadership, the vision, the management experience, all those things that go on with running business, Kent, will make a tremendous amount of difference from a budget standpoint, a priority standpoint, and a management standpoint from the Attorney General's office.
State of Arizona has been in the news lately about immigration. What's your view on what they've done there?
I think Arizona did what they felt like they had to do. It was a point of desperation. I mean, what's a state to do when the federal government has the power and the authority and the obligation to enforce the borders and they refuse to do so as a matter of will or lack thereof? A state only has two options. Pass legislation, as Arizona did, to empower itself to enforce state laws from a police power standpoint, or to take the route of the courts. That's one of the things I mentioned. I had an initiative that I brought up 2 weeks ago, I think it's been now, where I think the state of Oklahoma ought to consider holding the federal government accountable through the court process. that they have failed to do their job, that it's cost the state of Oklahoma at least $200 million a year. And
You mean because of immigration?
because of failing to enforce the border.
Yeah,
And it's
okay.
not just naturalization policy, Kent. It's the fact that under the naturalization clause, the guarantee clause, the invasion clause, all those things, they have a non-discretionary, non-preferential duty, mandatory duty, to secure the border. And the President of the United States has that power as Commander-in-Chief today. He doesn't need congressional action to do that. And his failure, the federal government's failure to do that, costs the state of Oklahoma a significant amount of money each year. And so I think, Mayor, a state can respond through legislation or through the courts to hold the federal government accountable, and I think both ought to be considered.
What would you do, though, if you're the Attorney General and you think a law is unconstitutional, but it might be very popular? Seems like that's a tough issue for an Attorney General to handle.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, I mean, I'll give you a real example of that. When I was in the Senate, I passed legislation, pro-life legislation, that immediately upon passage, Mayor, national abortion groups came in and said it's clearly unconstitutional. I worked with the AG's office to defend that, and it ended up being constitutional. Sometimes people throw things around like it's clearly unconstitutional, and they just say that to try to really chill legislation from being enacted. I think the two most important things an Attorney General can do, one is work with the legislature in advance to pass legislation from a scope standpoint, a language standpoint that is constitutional, and ideas and policy that the legislature wants to deal with. And then secondly, be an advocate on the back end. Defend, that's the role of the AG, is to defend the state, defend the agencies that are challenged. It's really not the role of the AG to determine constitutionality. It's there to represent the state's interest as it relates to the policies that have been passed. And I would do that as Attorney General.
The AG has been very active in recent years in environmental matters, as Mick had mentioned. He's also been active in some oil and gas areas where talking about price fixing and price manipulation and the like, and has brought some suits in that regard. Have you had a chance to look at any of those and know whether those would be carried on or how they'd be handled by your
Well, I've not looked at
administration?
current cases.
Okay.
I think it probably would be perhaps inappropriate to comment about current pending litigation, but from an Attorney General standpoint, I think an Attorney General at times, they are perceived as being pro-business or pro-consumer. And I think an AG ought to be pro-market. I think an AG ought to be about making sure that the marketplace is secure, that consumers receive the right kind of information, and that businesses are able to compete fairly with others. And so you don't have a monopolistic view. When that happens, when the market is protected, good things happen. Best prices, best products. And I think that's what the Attorney General's office ought to be involved in.
We got just over a minute left in the show. I want to give you an opportunity to tell the voters of Oklahoma why they should consider Scott Pruitt in the Republican primary.
Well, I think that unique circumstances today, freedom truly is at stake, liberty truly is at stake today, more so than ever before. And when you look at my background, I think I share the concerns of Oklahomans of wanting to take action to protect their liberty and freedom against Washington. And the experiences I've had are unique to do that. Constitutional law background, practiced as an attorney for 17 years, passing legislation at the Senate, Mayor, that dealt with those First Amendment concerns through the Religious Freedom Act, and the business relationships and leadership I've had all, I think, equip me to be a very effective advocate on behalf of the people of Oklahoma. Right. So I'm looking forward to walking with them and representing their interest and making sure that we do all we can to protect the constitutional values that they care about.
And the election for the primary is?
July 27th.
July 27th throughout the state of Oklahoma. Scott Pruitt, a Republican on the Republican side. Scott, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you all.
We appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Kent and I'll have a final word after this.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. We are wrapping up a show in which we visited with Scott Pruitt, who's running for the State Attorney General's office for Oklahoma.
Well, Scott has a very background with a distinguished career, really, in everything he's tried. He was a very effective state senator for 8 years and was in the leadership role out there. Then comes in and very effectively runs the Oklahoma Redhawks here in Oklahoma City. And obviously has, in years prior, had a very strong constitutional law background in his practice, which is rather unique to combine those three attributes. So he's making a strong run.
A former college baseball player himself, and you know, he has the political advantage of having served in the Tulsa market and also having served from a business standpoint in the Oklahoma City market. And a lot of times when you see a person running for statewide office, one of the questions you ask yourselves, well, in the two large metro areas, are they well known? And there's only a handful of candidates through the years that can say they have a presence and an identity in both markets. So I think that's one of the reasons that Scott stands out. This is the second of 3 candidates that we'll be visiting for on the Oklahoma Attorney General race. Last week we had Ryan Leonard on the show. Today with Scott Pruitt, and Jim Priest, the Democratic candidate, will join us next week. And Ken, it's just shaping up as a fascinating race. You have Leonard and Pruitt running on the Republican primary coming up in late July, and then you have Priest running in the Democratic. I think we're going to have an interesting primary and then an interesting race in November.
Yes, I think it'll be tight all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some website information. Scott Pruitt was today's guest. You can get more information on him at his website, scottpruitt.com. And of course, you can go to our website, theverdict.tv, and tell us about a show you'd like to see right here. For Kent, I'm Mick. We'll see you next time.
The preceding program was produced exclusively for the Cox Channel.